Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Kirby Lambert. I'm with the Outreach and Interpretation Program here at the Historical Society. This is the second program we've had today, which is a little unusual for us, but we are doing these two programs as part of the Myrna Loy's One Robe Métis Cultural Fest. And today at noon, when I introduced the program, I encouraged everybody to join the Myrna Loy tonight at 7:30, and was informed that it's sold out. So unfortunately, if you don't have tickets already, please stay home because they're not going to let you in. But that should be a great event. The whole thing, I think, is a great event. Métis culture is certainly something that we should all be more familiar with, and something worth celebrating. Also, a commemoration to Nicholas Vrooman, for those of you who knew him, kind of the leading authority on much of this history, and just an all-around great guy, and we lost him too soon. He was a great resource and good friend of the Historical Society. But anyway, it is our pleasure today to present Dr. Brendan Rensing. He's the Associate Director of the Red Center for Western Studies and an Associate Professor of History at Brigham Young University in Provo. His monograph, Native but Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, was published by Texas A&M University Press in 2018, and the following year it won the Spur Award for the best historical nonfiction book, and that was presented by the Western Writers of America. He's authored and edited numerous anthologies, articles, book chapters, podcasts, and reviews, and he also helps manage events and programming, awards, and research at BYU's Red Center. So it's my pleasure to introduce Brendan, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Kirby. And thanks to everyone for coming. This is a real pleasure and an honor. It was about 13 years ago or so. I was a grad student, and I spent a number of days here at the Montana Historical Society doing research for this book. And it was fun to spend the day here doing research for my next book project, and the reading room looked vaguely familiar. I only have very vague memories of those stressful days as a grad student. But it's really been good to be back here in Montana. Also, would like to say it was my pleasure to be able to know Nicholas Vrooman during some of that time. We both were invited to Ottawa a few years back to take part in a seminar about Métis studies, and he was so kind and so generous. And it was about a year after we were there in Ottawa together. I got a huge envelope in my mailbox, didn't know what it was, and it was his book. He just sent me a copy of the book he published, and he was just so generous and kind. And I also was very fortunate for a couple years to work as a historical consultant for the Native American Rights Fund that was working with the Little Shell tribe. And I was busy researching and writing history for them as part of one team that was working towards recognition. And then there was the legislative team, and we both were just to see who could get it done first, and the other team got it. I've never been so happy to lose a job because it was just so long overdue and so exciting for that to finally happen. I was especially interested in that because in researching and writing it was my dissertation, and then as my book, Little Shell Chippewas and Métis were always on the edges of the story because there was so much overlap between the Crees that were the real primary focus of the Montana portion of this book, and then Rocky Boys Chippewas. But the manuscript was 500 pages. The publisher said I had to chop it to 300 and something. And I really wanted to add a full chapter to bring in kind of the full, more of the Chippewa story, the Little Shell, and the Métis story, and there just wasn't room. That's something you learn when you research and write, that there's just never enough room. put in all the things you want. You're always having to narrow focus. So in any case, that's just a little backstory. So what I'm going to talk about today is about this book. I brought a box full of copies that I can sell. I have a bunch from an author discount. So, and I can do cash or card or Venmo or whatever, or not. I don't do these talks to sell books. I was sure that this is where the money was history, and I've been rudely shocked to find otherwise. So what I'm going to talk about today distills some of the main themes from this book project, which looks at Crees in Montana and Yaquis in Arizona, who both were considered foreign Indians who had crossed international borders into the United States and then sought permanent residence here in the United States. And I look at them as a way to think differently about Indigenous peoples and immigrant communities as they're examples of, both in terms of Indigenous peoples and immigrants, that don't fit into the existing programs or policies that the United States had developed to work with Native peoples or to work with immigrants. These foreign Indians, it was just not a category that the United States had thought about or was willing to think about. So this work pushes against a number of narratives that might be familiar, right? That we have these familiar stories that Native peoples were quite mobile, and that after the borders were drawn, they were crossing borders back and forth. But most of them were going in the other direction, crossing out of the United States. We think about Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce, or other, Sitting Bull, others. And here we have this weird example of natives coming into the United States. So these examples are a little weird for that. And this helps kind of complicate how we think about often overgeneralized idea of the American Indian experience. As here we have Native peoples that were indigenous to Montana. They'd been here long before the border was drawn, but they were not part of the federal Indian system for years. It also, I'm trying to introduce a lot of new ideas into immigration studies. There's almost no scholarship on Indigenous peoples as immigrants. And as I've traveled and done some international conferences with immigrations and migration scholars, and it's just not on their radar, and it really should be. All right, let's move on. So we have these two case studies, and in many ways they're very, very similar. We have Crees from Canada who cross into Montana in the late, in a major wave starting in the late 1880s, although they'd been here for quite a while before, coming for economic reasons, and then later coming for political reasons as refugees seeking political asylum. And I compare this with the other border, and with Yaquis from Sonora, who during almost the exact same time period crossed north into Arizona for very similar reasons, early on for economic reasons, and then later for political reasons, fleeing violence and coming as political refugees. Both of these groups face very mixed receptions. Both face similar challenges of ambiguous legal status, the threat of deportation, and in many cases, actual deportation. This prejudice against them as being foreign, something they just can never escape. And then eventually these processes of building alliances with locals in Montana, in Arizona, building friendships with politicians and prominent citizens who are able to help them start to build a coalition to push for legal residence and eventually federal recognition as American Indian tribes. So there's so much similarity in these two stories, which is why I was attracted to doing this as a comparative work. A big discrepancy, though, is that although they both come at roughly the same time period, Crees and then the Chippewas who join with Crees receive a reservation and federal recognition about 35-ish years after coming as political refugees. But the Yaquis down in Arizona, it's about 100 years. So if the reasons for coming were so similar, the initial timelines were so similar, why this huge discrepancy in chronology? That's something I wanted to try to understand. So what I'd like to do is kind of do a sprint survey kind of through these histories really fast, and then think a little bit about them comparatively, and try to understand that as we read them together in parallel, do they speak to each other? Do we find something out about the Montana story by having read the Arizona story? And I argue that we do. And in the end, I'll wrap up by bringing this to the present and thinking a little bit about things that we have going on in the modern world, and sensitivity and awareness we need to have about immigrant communities that might be falling through the cracks or might be ignored, be accidentally or intentionally, as was the case with these. And perhaps I'll spend a little more time on the Montana side than the Arizona one. Although maybe that's the story you guys already know. We'll see. So first, let's think about borders. I'm convinced that it's along borders where some of the most dramatic, compelling human stories unfold. These landscapes on the edges of empire, right, far removed from the centers of power, are often simultaneously the places where empires have the least control, but also where they are trying to exert the most overt and often most violent forms of control as a way to define the boundaries of the nation, as a way to define who belongs and who does not. But it's along these edges where people often find opportunity and can find that by crossing, they sometimes can gain things, right? I grew up in Northwest Washington, up here in Bellingham. Has anyone been to Bellingham, Washington? And the border is about 10 miles north. And I remember as a kid watching the weather reports, and they would show kind of, the Doppler radar with all those blobs of here's a weather pattern moving in from the Puget Sound, and it would get up to Bellingham on the map, and then there was this hard line right north of my town, and just black, like the void, right? And the weather would just disappear up into nothingness, as if there's nothing up there, right? But if you look here, there's something really peculiar about. I think I can zoom. We zoom this in. So this is zoomed in. If you saw how that went, do you see what's weird about the border here? 49th parallel, right? It goes across Boundary Bay, but then there's this weird little spit, Point Roberts, dips south. And the United States didn't let Canada have it when we did the Border Commission. Does anyone have any idea why? So controlling Point Roberts lets you control fisheries. It was one of many reasons, right? But did you guys know this, that fish just swim right across the international line? Who would have thought, right? But of course they do. The environment, so we come in and we've drawn these lines of these, especially the 49th parallel, right? This just straight cut across the continent, right? But what do we have flowing across it, right? Rivers, watersheds, mountain ranges. And with that comes not just fishes, but birds, bison, and people, right? They follow the landscape. This is down on the southern border, and we can see these mountain range that is cut north and south. So we have this weird juxtaposition, right, of the border as something that is fixed, right? But at the same time, it often, especially with these really straight line ones, doesn't really respect the natural world. Well, for native peoples living on the northern plains or in the Sonoran Desert, the 49th parallel in the north or the U.S.-Mexican border in the south had no real intrinsic meaning for them. It wasn't a part of their worldview. And in the nation-state's attempt to try to draw these borders and impose order over a chaotic world, that's what they're trying to do with borders. They want to create order. They often are also creating more chaos. The creation of a border invites people to transgress it because there are differences on either side of the border, right? Think about during Prohibition, all the rum running across the U.S.-Canadian border, right? So the border created this differential in where you could consume and purchase alcohol, right? Or for Native peoples, signing treaties differently on one side or the other, to go across the border for a better life or economic opportunity, or to escape persecution or violence. So borders, paradoxically, are attempting to order the world, but often doing the opposite. I already mentioned briefly some of the Native peoples who actively understood the power that the border had and tried to use it in order to escape, specifically to escape the United States. So beginning in the 1820s and beyond, we have Lenapes or Shawnees, Delawares, going all the way from the East Coast, eventually all the way down into Mexico. Kickapoos as well from the upper Midwest established communities intentionally across the line in Mexico. Apaches like Geronimo and others consistently used the U.S.-Mexican border as a way to raid and then to escape south across the line, knowing that the U.S. military wouldn't pursue them. In the 1870s, of course, we have Sitting Bull runs north to Canada and spends about 4 years at Wood Mountain. In 1877, Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce try to make it, hoping to join Sitting Bull. So the border offered them an opportunity, and they got within about 30 miles. Well, we have these two groups, as I mentioned, that go in the wrong direction. So we have to ask some really weird questions. How does the United States address the presence of non-American Indians or foreign Indians? We have questions of, well, was the enforcement of the two borders the same, or was the Canadian and the Mexican borders differently? Also, how did local non-native white borderland communities or labor markets in Montana or Arizona differ? And did they offer different opportunities or different realities for the natives who crossed into them? And last, I've thought a lot in this book about how Americans viewed Indigenous peoples from Canada differently than they viewed Native peoples from Mexico. These are some of the key differences that I kind of teased out from these stories to try to understand, again, that big difference in chronology. And by thinking about them, we get a much richer understanding of American state formation, and we discover that the U.S. had a huge blind spot in policies concerning in policies for immigration and policies for Native peoples, because these groups were not normal immigrants and they also weren't normal Indians. And as a result, they suffered for decades, and the Yaquis for almost a full century. In the United States, due to a lack of consistent or clearly defined federal policy concerning them. The saddest part being that all along the way, there were very easy solutions and often very cheap solutions, which could have been pursued, but were not. When we think about, so let's walk through the Montana story really quick. Oh, I'm sorry that you can't quite, I have like sources for all of these things, but it's a little bit fuzzy on the screen. Crees and Chippewas both have a long history in what would become the United States. Since the 17th century, both had been consistently moving westward and south from some of their homelands up towards Hudson Bay, the Great Lakes region. Lewis and Clark, right in the early 1800s, they described Crees as such. They wrote, they are a wandering nation, are well disposed towards whites, and treat their traders with respect. They might probably be induced to visit an establishment on the Missouri at the Yellowstone River. So at this early moment, Lewis and Clark are writing quite favorably of the Crees and saying, maybe we can get them to come down and trade with us instead of trading with Britain. So their commerce, their activity coming south was welcomed, was encouraged by the United States. By the time we get to the 1880s, however, things are very different in Montana, aren't they? Montana is no longer interested in attracting Cree fur traders to come across the border. First of all, the fur trade had mostly collapsed. But by that point as well, Montana and the United States was aggressively moving to restrict Native movements. forcing them to sign treaties, restricting them to reservations, and so forth. Concurrent, they're trying to build up white populations in Montana Territory so that they can then transition towards statehood. And off-reservation, mobile native populations were not a part of that story. They were not going to be contributing to building Montana up in the way that Americans wanted them to. So what do? What does America do? Well, they try to get them to stop crossing the border. Here's what one soldier at Fort Assiniboine says. This is in 1881. To his soldiers says, "Send out as strong a force as possible under a careful officer to notify the foreign Indians to return," and here's the great phrase, "to their own country, and so prevent them from driving game away from the hunting grounds of our own Indians." So you can see here they're starting to differentiate between Indians that are Canadian, as if the Crees thought of themselves as Canadian, right? Versus, Indians who were our own Indians, right? So they're differentiating Indians that belong and Indians that don't. Well, this leads to years of attempts by the U.S. military to restrict Cree movements to keep them from crossing the border. This is Gustavus Doan writing to his wife just the next year in 1882. Doan is a name you may be familiar with. He was later involved with the Marias Massacre, the Baker family massacre. But this is what he wrote of the Crees. "I was never as tired of a tribe as I am of this one." Ooh, man, those are harsh words. But the Crees were driving them nuts because they knew the land better, they could move faster, and they were continually crossing the border, often engaging in cattle thieving, and then running back across the line and kind of thumbing their noses at the U.S. troops who could never quite catch them. So if you think early to that Lewis and Clark era, we had, during the fur trade, we were trying to entice them to come down. But once kind of the settler colonial state starts building up in Montana, they want them to stop at the border. So that early kind of economic immigrant activity of them coming south is no longer welcome. Well, in response to this, one of the key chiefs who was involved was Big Bear. And he and many of his Cree followers eventually go back north to Canada. And they resisted signing treaties for a number of years. And Big Bear had quite a reputation in Canada and here in Montana. And eventually they do go back north and they accept a treaty and reservation settlement. They're settled actually pretty far away from the border, which I think was intentional. Canada put them a little farther north. But just a few years later, in 1885, the Métis leader Louis Riel, together with Crees, Chippewas, Assiniboine, Gros Ventre, Métis, lots of different native groups rise up. And they have the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. And as a part of that, there is a massacre of white settlers at Frog Lake, which is where Big Bear's tribe is then residing. And I won't get into all the details of it. Big Bear had been trying to prevent something like this from happening actively and wasn't able to keep all of his followers peaceful. In response to this, they run. And to escape prosecution and potential likely execution, his son Little Bear takes a group and flees south across the border back to Montana, where they had been for most of the previous decade, while Big Bear stays in Canada to take the blame and to allow them to flee. In a later recollection, Little Bear recalls his father saying, it said to him, "Depart, my son, flee to the south at once. Across the line there shall be liberty for you. Here you can enjoy it no longer." The details are a little fuzzy about how and when they cross, but they arrive at Fort Assiniboine. Little Bear, the story goes, tries to extend his hand to Colonel C.S. Otis there at Fort Assiniboine, and he refuses and says, "Your hands are still bloody. I cannot shake hands with you," because they had heard about Frog Lake. And Otis is starting to get ready to round them up and deport them back to Canada. And again, the documentation is fuzzy, but at some point they receive word from Washington, D.C., that Little Bear's Crees are going to be allowed to stay in Montana as political refugees. They're going to be granted asylum. And our understandings of refugee status, asylum status, it's not quite the same as it is today, but they weren't going to be forced to go back north. So what does this mean? What does it mean to be a refugee Indian? Does this, they're providing protection for you? Does it mean that they'll be assimilated into existing, the federal Indian bureaucracy and given lands to settle on? Does it mean that they're going to be recognized as Indians? Well, in the end, the answer was none of the above. Nothing is done, and they're left to wander. So if we use 1885 kind of as the starting point of foreign Crees coming into Montana, it's 36 years until 1916 when they gain federal recognition and finally have lands of their own to settle on. For that 36 years, they're living landless in Montana. 36 years of transient movements across the state, living on the edges of Montanan cities, literally living in the city dumps outside of Great Falls, Helena, Butte, and elsewhere, living off the scraps and refuse that they could find, starving, sometimes to death, especially in the winters. There's epidemic diseases they suffer from. Native to Montana, they have decades of connections here, but being denied recognition as natives and being denied integration into a system that existed there of reservations. But also lacking the economic skill set to participate in the development of Montana industry, like other immigrants, say, from Europe were doing. Right? So they weren't really fitting in either world. 10 years later, in 1896, after lots of complaining from local Montanans and Montanan politicians, the U.S. government appropriates $5,000 to round them up and to deport them. This is done by future General John J. Pershing, who led the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. Black Jack Pershing, called that because he led a contingent of Buffalo Soldiers. And it's a brutal affair, but they round them up and deport them in the summer of 1896. I'll spare you the details, but I mean, there's even a story of this one Cree man who was so terrified of returning north, of what would happen, that he committed suicide in full view of everyone, rather than go back north. Well, they're deported back north in rail cars. They're put across the line, and almost all of them immediately turn around and go right back to Montana. About 75-ish%. We don't know the exact numbers. There's a popular Cree telling that they beat the soldiers back to Fort Assiniboine. And they very well probably did. So the story of their landless, wandering, and needless suffering continues. And the prejudice and vitriol that they face in Montana is really, really shocking. These are two cartoons from the Anaconda Standard in 1901, which is one of the most kind of anti-Cree newspapers that there were, always railing on about them, right? Here, suggesting that they're all drunks, the modern Cree on the warpath to the saloon. Here, be it ever so humble, there's no place like home, right? Like, making fun of them, right? For the fact that they're living in destitute poverty in the city dump. Not much compassion here. So Crees are unable to establish kind of stable communities because they're constantly having to move around, wandering and homeless. One recalled, this is in 1911, we wintered in Havre, Montana in 1911. It was very hard. We were living in tents. It was cold. I was just talking, we have a grad student here from Bozeman, Micah, who's writing a dissertation about life on the High Line, right? And how would you like to be in a flimsy tent in a Havre winter? Yikes, right? It was cold. It was very hard on the horses. They didn't have any feed. There was no hay. The horses were always shaking because of hunger. One paper wrote, all the efforts to secure aid from Uncle Sam have failed, and the government has treated the half-starved band in a most shameful manner. So there are a few sympathetic voices. Well, starting in the early 1900s, there's another group of landless Indians in Montana, Chippewas, and associated bands of Métis, under the leadership of a Chippewa named Rocky Boy, as well as a number of others. And there's multiple attempts by the U.S. government to settle Rocky Boy's Chippewas on existing reservations. Many of the Chippewas could establish or claim that they were born on the U.S. side of the line, even though, up in the Pembina and Minnesota borderlands, it's all pretty fuzzy about, exactly what side of the line people were born on because they were crossing so often. But Rocky Boy is working with prominent Montanans. Frank Linderman is a great friend of Rocky Boy and a great friend of Little Bear, Charlie Russell, and others. And they introduce them to prominent newspaper editors, prominent politicians. And they start pushing for a bill in Congress. To this, there's incredible local opposition. The book goes on for, ad nauseum about, they almost get a reservation, and then it's shot down. They're settled on the Blackfoot Reservation, and then they're kicked out. It just goes on and on. Eventually, in 1916, they succeed. And at the last moment, because all along, Little Bear and his Crees are trying also, but they had a much more negative reputation in Montana, a lot more prejudice against the Crees than there were against Rocky Boy and his Chippewas. But at the last moment, they're brought in with the Rocky Boy effort, and they're settled together. And this is the Rocky Boy Chippewa Cree Reservation, right, south of Havre. So it's not until 1916 that they enter kind of what we might think of as the more familiar mainstream American Indian experience. Everything up to then was doesn't really fit into our narratives and our stories of what it meant to be Native, and what the Native American experience was, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because they were something other. Not quite Indian, not quite immigrant, refugees, but ignored and not really given any support, harassed, deported, allowed to suffer and die for decades. Okay, let's go south and bounce this off of the Arizona example and then see how they compare. Yaquis, I don't know if you guys are very familiar with the history of northern Mexico and Yaquis, but they had, so this is, here's Sonora and Chihuahua, here's the Gulf of California. And the Yaqui River Valley, which is right here, the Yaquis were the last unconquered indigenous population in Mexico. Since as early as the 1730s, Spain fought war after war to try to subdue the Yaquis, and they resisted and remained independent, all the way up into the late 1800s. All the while, though, Yaquis had gained a number of very valuable economic skills in industrial works. They were expert miners. As a matter of fact, is it on? It is on this map. If you look way up here, you see that mine right up towards the border, Arizonac? That's where we get the name Arizona from. And it was a silver mine discovered by Yaquis. And so they're mining all across Sonora into Chihuahua. And of course, once there's gold, silver, and copper mines that start popping up in Arizona, and they need labor, and who are the expert laborers just nearby? Yaqui Indians. And Yaquis, always willing to move and be mobile, eagerly go north and get jobs. There's many times in which mine owners, even wrote specifically about how they wanted to have Yaqui workers, not Chinese laborers or laborers from Europe. They wanted the Yaqui miners because they were the most valuable. They're doing the similar things with railroad projects and eventually all of the various canal projects across southern Arizona. Yaqui labor is highly valued. So again, like that, the example up north, there's this early moment where their labor, their presence in the United States is welcomed and encouraged. We're trying to have them come north to help build up Arizona. All the while, there is this continued violence in Mexico. 1825, 1834, late 1850s, and then in the 1890s, region-wide warfare, first of Spain, but then Mexico against the Yaquis. And all the while, I mean, this is just right across the border. So Arizona newspapers are reporting, I mean, national newspapers, everyone's talking about it, about, oh, there's another Yaqui war, another Yaqui revolt in Sonora and Mexico. Because American newspapers really liked to look down their noses at Mexico and like to talk about how, oh, Mexico can't keep their people under control. Mexico is being barbaric in how they're treating these native peoples, always, ignoring the fact of what we were doing north of the border. But because of this, Arizonans were nervous about Yaquis. We wanted their labor, but man, they've read a lot of stories in the papers about Yaqui violence, about them being warlike and fierce and bellicose and so forth. So what does this mean for a Yaqui living in Arizona when warfare breaks out again in Sonora? What does this mean for the Yaquis north of the border? Do they want to stand up and let everyone know that they're Yaqui? Well, it maybe is how they've gotten their employment, but maybe not. So many of them, they try to lay low. And they try to blend in with other immigrant communities. And this is going to be a key point in the differences between how these two histories kind of roll out. By the time we get to the turn of the century, Porfirio Diaz was the president of Mexico, and the Diaz regime declares a war of extermination against the Yaquis. They wanted to clear the entire Yaqui River Valley out of Yaquis because it was a fertile river valley and he wanted to industrialize it, bring in large-scale agriculture and modernize that region. Also wanted to attract American investment into northern Mexico. And so beginning in 1887, as a part of the war, they're not just exterminating and killing Yaquis, but they're rounding them up, putting them on trains and then deporting them to the Yucatan, to southern Mexico, and selling them into slavery to work on plantations, mostly in the Yucatan, but in Oaxaca and some other places as well. Here's what one observer writes. I saw one bunch of Indians brought from the interior to Guaymas, a port city, and was informed that they had been hauled 484 kilometers in stock cars, which had never been cleaned out after being used for transporting cattle. There were 1,500 of these poor devils, men, women, and children, huddled together in the cars like so many hogs. It was one of the most pitiful scenes I ever witnessed. The excessive summer heat and the closely packed Indians turned the boxcars into coffins. Every Yaqui had died before the port was reached. I'm going to skip all of this. There's story after story of just the horrific brutality of the deportation, of the enslavement, and then in the Yucatan of the slave labor. They die in tremendous numbers. There's talk of extinguishing a race of people. Well, these Yaquis had a history of mobility. And so when this violence, and they're used to violence, right? But this is now different. And not just, Mexico wasn't just trying to get them to sign a treaty, Mexico was trying to exterminate them, and then with the deportation and enslavement. And they had this history with families and friends who for decades had been going north to Arizona. So what do a lot of them do in the face of this violence? They cross the border, right? Just as Crees had followed familiar trails and paths and come down to Montana, right, to escape violence. They are granted some nebulous form of unofficial asylum if they would register with the state in Arizona. Very few did. because no one wanted to stand up and declare themselves as Yaqui. And so they went on the underground. And they blended in with existing Yaqui communities and with broader Mexican and Mexican-American immigrant communities. When we get to the 1920s, when there's all kinds of immigration reform in the United States, their status is very unclear. And many of them the state says you have to come forward and declare. But in a single Yaqui household, depending on when you may have a multi-generational household, and depending on when they crossed, you may have someone who crossed at a point where they were going to be given political refugee status. Someone who crossed a few years later who's also in that household maybe crossed a couple years too late and might be deported. And now you also have a generation or two of Arizona-born, American-born Yaquis, right? And so many, again, just tried to blend in and lay low. Well, unlike the Crees, they had been very successful in establishing communities. Right? They had valuable labor skills. And so they often didn't own the land they lived on, but they had communities, neighborhoods. If you're familiar with Tempe, Arizona, now they all blend together, but right west of Tempe, Arizona is a small town called Guadalupe, which most people think of as a Mexican town. It was a Yaqui town, and it still is today. It's kind of a trilingual English, Spanish, Yaqui community. There were Yaqui settlements in Scottsdale, in Chandler, Arizona, and Gilbert. This is up in the Phoenix Valley. There was a Yaqui neighborhood about 1.5 miles from where my wife grew up. And when I was doing this research, I said to my father-in-law, I said, hey, did you know that those 3 streets down there are a Yaqui settlement? And there's these 3 streets that, it's Avenida Primera, Segunda, Tercera, like in Spanish. And they just always thought, oh, that's a Mexican neighborhood. And then down in Tucson, on this map it's a little bit small, but down in Tucson, that's where the majority of them were in a number of communities. But you can see all these dots along the rail lines, along canal lines where they'd established communities. So interestingly, they had economic skills that contributed to what Arizona was trying to do, right? Building up industry, building up cities, infrastructure, and they could contribute to that. So they were able to have more stability than the Crees were. Here's some zoomed in ones. These are all various Yaqui settlements in Tucson. This is what I should have shown you as I was trying to explain it all. And there's long histories that I talk about in the book of land that was purchased by someone and held in trust for them, and they were allowed to stay on it, and then they lose those deeds, and they're moved around, all kinds of messy histories, and similar things up in the Phoenix, the Salt River Valley. And this goes on. It goes on for decades. They're in a very odd and precarious situation, as I noted. Some are here. Many at that. By the time we get to the 1930s, 1940s, many were now born here, right? And many are afraid of being deported. I'm sorry. I'm skipping over a bunch of stuff here so we can have time for Q&A. And I think you guys are more interested in the Montana stuff anyway. By the time we get to the 1960s, there are deep problems in these Yaqui communities, widespread poverty. And interestingly, though, remember Lyndon Baines Johnson, The Great Society? Some of you, I'm not going to accuse anyone here of being old enough to remember that, but I suspect that a few of you might remember that. There are all kinds of programs and funding available for communities to apply for grants and funding to build community centers, to improve health, education, all kinds of things, right? In inner cities, poverty-stricken areas. Well, there also were lots of specific programs for American Indians. But guess what? The Yaquis couldn't apply for them. They applied for grants from the Ford Foundation, all these different, large charities, and they were told, sorry, these are reserved for American Indians. Eventually, in the 1960s, they start to organize politically, and they form what was called the Pascua Yaqui Association. And it was a nonprofit, which then does fundraising, receives funding from the federal government as a nonprofit, and is able to purchase land outside of Tucson and to start to build an actual stable community that they owned. And this is where the reservation is today. It's southwest of Tucson. Pasqua is what it's called. And they go through lots of similar situations of local resistance, just like Crees and Chippewas had here in Montana. But by the time they get to the 1970s, the Office of Economic Opportunity under Johnson was gone. All that federal funding had dried up, and they're left again on their own. And whereas before they had not pushed for federal tribal recognition, because if you remember in the 1950s and 60s, that was the era of termination, where the federal government was actively terminating tribal status. The U.S. government was not in the business of creating new tribes, right, in the 60s. And so they had been advised to don't mention that. You need to actually explicitly say, we're not trying to be recognized. By the 70s, though, they've run out of options. And much as Crees did here in Montana, they start making allies with prominent Arizona citizens, some prominent academics, anthropologist Edward Spicer and his wife Rosamond, Morris K. Udall, senator from Arizona, really takes up the Yaqui case. Carl Hayden from Arizona, another senator. And in very similar fashion as we saw in Montana, they're, one step forward, two steps back. They go through this long process and fight, and eventually in 1978, secure federal tribal recognition, and which gives them access to other sources of funding and support for them to build up a stable community. But again, 60 years after Crees and Chippewas had attained federal tribal recognition in Montana. Today, both these communities here in Montana and Arizona, they continue to maintain transnational ties with families and across the borders. So I've touched on a few comparative ideas that I'll kind of just conclude with. And actually, I think I'll skip over most of them. But some key differences: labor, right? Yaquis had labor skills that allowed them lots of economic opportunity, which allowed them to create some more stable actual communities, right? Whereas Crees and Chippewas, they didn't have that going for them. But ironically, since the Yaquis had more stable-ish communities, it allowed them to be ignored. Whereas Crees and Chippewas wandering around landless, homeless across Montana, they were conspicuous, they were visible. And in a kind of a cruel, twist of irony, I think led to them receiving recognition and reservation lands sooner, because Montanans wanted to get rid of them, wanted to just put them on a reservation, get them out of town. Here's what one observer writes. This is Margaret Plassman. She says, "Nothing was done about the Cree and Chippewa state of affairs for a long time, although the Indians were considered a nuisance. Not that they broke laws, stole, and the like, for I never heard of any such charges being brought against them, although I will say those charges are being brought against them all the time in the newspapers. But people, listen to this. People were tired of seeing this poverty at their door and justly felt that some provision should be made for these exiles." So they didn't want to see the suffering anymore. Well, for Yaquis in Arizona, the suffering wasn't quite as visible, right? They had communities and neighborhoods that they were living in. They had jobs. Another interesting wrinkle, which I didn't quite mention, I think I hinted at a little bit, is that when Americans looked north and thought about Canadians and Canadian Indians, they saw two completely distinct populations, right? When they looked south and thought about Mexicans and Mexican Indians, most Americans didn't see as much of a difference, which allowed Yaqui Indians to blend in with Mexican and Mexican-American communities, which at various points in their history in Arizona was very valuable, that they could lay low and not be noticed. Ironically, by pretending to be the very people, right, that they were trying to escape from. So some differences in kind of perceived ethnicity leads to some important differences in these two stories as well. Why should we think about this today? I don't think many of us would have to go very far back in any of our own family histories to find a story of people fleeing something, people moving for opportunity, moving for safety, for protection, right? That's human history. It's a history of mobility. It's often a history of flight under duress. And in these stories, we have histories of people perishing in a land of plenty, suffering from inconsistent federal policies or just non-existent policies when there were very easy solutions to be found. But instead, the United States ignored them, or worse, harassed them, deported them, or maybe just simply hoped that they would just go away or disappear. Actually, government officials are repeatedly saying, ignore them and they'll go away. It was unnecessary. There were easy and cheap solutions, which makes this difficult history to read. I won't get on a contemporary soapbox for very long, but you don't have to look very far in the news today to find stories not just of migration, but of all kinds of peoples who are falling through cracks, peoples who are suffering in lands of plenty, and for whom there could be solutions, maybe solutions that maybe won't be easy or cheap, but solutions that we could pursue. I think it's incumbent on us to do that, right? It's sad to read these kinds of stories and then to look at the news today and recognize that we've brought some of those horrors from the past fully into the present. We haven't solved these things yet, and we're still committing the same, horrible things that were done then. And I will say there still are unrecognized Native populations here in the United States. Little Shell, thankfully, is no longer on that list, but there still are many federally unrecognized indigenous communities that are going through some of these same struggles. So it's my hope that we can use these kinds of messy and complicated and sometimes challenging histories to train ourselves to seek out people in need, specifically those who are maybe being overlooked, and then hopefully give them the aid they need. So thank you for your attention. I don't know if I went longer than I was supposed to on that, but I think we have time for, how much time do we have, Kirby, for questions? Okay. And at the end, again, I'm happy to, if there's something different you want to talk about, I'm happy to stay and talk afterwards for a while. I have a box full of books if anyone wants to buy one. Questions. And I'll probably repeat your questions so that the live stream can pick it up.
My family's mainly from, I'm like 116 Creek, and they're really from Minnesota, but I know nothing about it, but I know they were back and forth. And I just know my grandmother's maiden name was Gautier.
French name?
They said, I think it was the French trapper and the Indian maiden. And that's as much as I know nothing.
Yeah. It's across the Northern Plains. This is a very familiar story. Crees, with Crees, whether you use the term Chippewa, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Assiniboines, Gros Ventres, Blackfeet, many of them were intermarrying with French traders, later Scottish traders and others. I mean, that's why how we get these Métis populations, which is different than just mixed heritage peoples. The Métis, are a very specific, ethnic and cultural group. But it's a very familiar story.
My grandmother would say, I'm going back east to visit family. She was going to Minnesota.
Well, interesting. So when Nicholas Vrooman and I were up in Ottawa at that at this Métis symposium, and it was there with, all of the luminaries of Métis academics: Chris Anderson, Brenda McDougall, Nicole St. Onge. Like, if you've read any books about Métis history, these are the people writing about it. And we sat around for 2 or 3 days discussing all these things. And by the end, we were all kind of surprised by how multi-ethnic most of these populations were. And so, as I'm thinking about Little Bear or Rocky Boy, as they are talking with U.S. officials, and they're like, well, where were you born? Or what's your heritage? Who are your parents and grandparents, right? They're like, well, I'm Cree, but I have a grandmother who was Blackfoot, and my great aunt was Assiniboine, and this is the story with all of them. And then the Métis populations bring in, French and other heritages as well. It's not really till, Canada and the United States comes in and wants to sign treaties, and the nation state needs to define, okay, so who belongs in this group? And we need to define you as, Turtle Mountain Chippewas. And here's who belongs and who doesn't, right? And you are Chippewas. Sure, but they also have all kinds of other bloodlines as well. So the Northern Plains, it's really challenging to try to figure out genealogies because they're just so intermixed. Not just with the French, but with each other as well.
What do you need out of the book?
Oh my goodness. So, well, again, the Métis and the Little Shell story almost entirely. Because they are, what I ended up really focusing a lot of the book on was those who were suffering from the prejudice of being a foreign Indian. And some of Little Shell, Métis, and others didn't quite have that thrown at them quite as much, right? There were Métis who were living here since, communities in the 1860s, like well-established Métis communities in Montana and in the Dakotas as well, right? And so I really focused on, well, who are the specific groups that were suffering from the foreign label? And that's why most of it focuses on the Cree story, and Rocky Boy and the Chippewas don't really enter until really late. I don't talk about their trek from Wisconsin, the Dakotas westward. There's just so much. I created a website, nativebutforeign.org, where all of the stuff that I had to cut out of the book, I put on a website. And I integrated it into the footnotes. So throughout the footnotes, you'll see, for more information on X, Y, and Z, go to nativebutforeign.org. And on there, there's ways you can sort it by chapter 8, footnote 34. And then here's a few paragraphs of extra discussion, and then long lists of sources. When you do this research, and if you slaved away for a whole week, on this one little tidbit that you dug up in an archive somewhere, and then you have to cut it out, it's killing your babies, right? Oh, that's painful. And I had to cut 150 pages or so, and I just didn't know what I was going to cut. And I said, you know what? I'll make a website. And so it won't be in the main text, but there were so many things that I think were valuable. I had pages that were all footnote and no text, because I just put all this extra stuff. I dug this stuff up, and I want to make it available, and I didn't want to cut it, so I put it on the website. Made it a little bit less painful. The other problem is that if you want to research Blackfoot history or Lakota history, you can go to the National Archives, and in Record Group 75, they'll be really carefully organized, records for all these different tribal groups that had official treaty relationships with the United States. But for these Crees, Yaquis, and Chippewas, there's no such record groups. There's no such collections. And so finding their records, it was just a nightmare. They appear on the edges of other groups. And so I had gone and dug up and located lots of things that had not been located before, which made me feel guilty about cutting stuff. I'm like, no, this stuff, it needs to be out there. I think everyone feels like everything needs to be out there because we think our work is so important, but anyway. Yes. I have a long list of all the future books I'm going to write, but we'll probably never be able to get to. I did write quite a bit for the Native American Rights Fund. but they have control over that material, so I don't own that. And I think at some point I'll have a discussion with them and try to publish some articles. But also, I very much approach this project as a Western historian and a Borderlands historian, not as I'm not Indigenous. I don't come from these communities, and I was not trying to write a community history. That's not my story to tell. I wanted to use their stories to understand something about the borders in the West, right? And so, I would love to try to contribute, right, to doing this, but that's the little shell community. They would need to take the reins on that, right? And there's so much community knowledge and knowledge within that cultural community that's not in the archives anywhere, right? So they'd probably be better suited to write it. But Nicholas Ruman's book is an excellent place to start. It's exhaustive in its coverage.
So many threads to address, but just one question. The Métis, from my reading of Nicholas's book and others, were a significant, very significant economic force on the northern plains. Their fall and spring buffalo hunts with the Red River carts and the mixed technology, of that culture, and crossed the border frequently, right? Am I correct in that?
Yeah.
Back and forth, following the herds. So late 1800s, those herds were extinguished by buffalo hunters and primarily all was left with the bones, and then they were turned into phosphate fertilizer. And I think that you would find that there were significant non-Indian figures that say, we destroy the buffalo, we destroy the Indians.
Yeah.
I mean, it was an extermination strategy.
They talked about that intentionally, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you think that that strategy is connected to establishment of the border?
The strategy of eliminating bison herds.
Yeah, and then controlling the Indian tribe
Yeah, I mean it's all.
of a piece.
Yeah, it's all part of the same. It's all part of the same story, right? Of, as white settlement is moving out across the plains, Native peoples need to be confined, and the availability of the bison herds is what allowed them to be so mobile out on the plains. I mean, remember that many of these plains tribes that we think about a few generations previous, they had a presence on the plains, but they came out to the plains seasonally, right? Where once they acquire horses and some other technologies, they're on the plains full time, right? And once Europeans and Americans come in with the fur trade, they then go out there and engage in the fur trade full time. So it was the presence of bison and other fur-bearing animals, right, that gave them such mobility and power across the region. And so to encourage white settlement, to control the border, the bison had to go. Yeah. I would highly recommend that there's a great book by a historian, Michel Hogue. He's a historian at Carleton University up in Ottawa. He wrote a book called Métis and the Medicine Line, where it won a lot of awards. If you go to the Red Center's YouTube channel, I brought him in for a talk. You can watch a talk that he gave. And he very convincingly argues about how powerful the Métis were across that border region, and that so many of the other histories that we think about on both sides of the border were actually being driven by Métis actors, and that the power of the Métis was what was driving so many events and developments.
From Nicholas's book, I find it very ironic that the leather produced by the hunting of the buffalo were used in part as transmission belts for machinery. So the Métis harvest the buffalo, create this industrial society which then destroys them.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Cowhide, and I don't know the biology specifically, but it didn't hold up as well in this industrial treatment as as belts on steam engines and stuff. So the bison hide worked better.
So in a machine shop, you would have water-driven or coal-driven engine that has a line shaft across the length of the shop, and wherever there's a machine, there's a
Yeah.
transmission line of leather belt running that machine away to the land.
Yeah.
Dangerous as hell.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about native peoples using bison, in so many ways, and using it, for clothing, for shelter and so forth, and then those hides being harvested and then used. I mean, especially like in textile mills, to then make the textiles that this opposing civilization was using for those same purposes. Right? There's very unexpected intersections. Yeah, in the back.
So, back in the 70s, there was a popular book, Yaqui Way of Knowledge. Is that of any significance?
Yes. So Carlos Castaneda, this guy, he wrote this book, kind of like a new agey. I don't want to. Magical realism, but he had learned all this knowledge from a Yaqui elder who had visions and so forth, and it was completely fabricated. Yeah, but it's interesting to think about, why did he pick the Yaqui, right? It was an exotic indigenous people that had resonance. Like, people for generations had heard about Yaquis as this fiercely like the last independent indigenous nation, in Mexico. Like, so the name meant something, because they could have picked any. And I think it's also interesting that they picked not a recognized American Indian tribe, right? That might in some way stand up and say no, right? Who had a political voice in the United States. He chose to pick a group that was familiar but had no official political voice. In a way, I don't know. But it was frustrating as a researcher when I'm trying to dig up stuff about Yaquis, and then it's, oh my goodness, Castaneda keeps on popping up.
Well, Brennan, thank you very much. This was excellent.
Thank you.
I think if anybody wants to buy the book or ask questions, we can continue the discussion. But I just want to say thank you very much. That was excellent.
Thank you guys.